This, as you guys know already, is my long-term Royal Enfield Bear 650, a motorcycle which I had the pleasure of reviewing in California during the first ride, and I remember coming back really impressed and pronouncing it as my favorite 650 from the Royal Enfield stable. Mainly because I felt in terms of riding dynamics, you had a motorcycle which kind of complemented the engine, which handled really well. Already in California, I had a nagging feeling rear shocks on this are a little too stiff, and they are going to be a problem, especially when we come back to India and ride it here, especially on our infrastructure and our broken roads. And after living with it for the last month or so, yeah, that is undoubtedly the case. There is no doubt that, again, unfortunately, Royal Enfield have missed the mark when it comes to the rear shock. So I have been fiddling around with the preload for the rear shock, and I think we have made a breakthrough. But I think before I present that solution to you, it's very important that we understand how suspension works and how we look at suspension, because I think there is a lot of ambiguity. There's not much clarity in terms of what each of these components do in terms of the spring and in terms of damping. So we're going to touch on it a little bit to hopefully help you understand the solution which I'm presenting and how exactly it works. This is one thing which I hear far too often from a lot of people, especially in this motorcycling industry, is that if you add preload, it would make the spring stiffer. I don't think that's the right way of looking at preload, because preload doesn't really affect the spring rate of the spring. A spring is stiff, it has higher spring rate. You adding preload doesn't make it stiffer per se. A better way of looking at preload is in which part of the stroke the suspension is working and how preload affects that. For example, if you are a 90 kg guy and you're sitting on springs which are designed for a guy who's only 70 kgs, when you sit on the bike, the suspension is going to be working in the bottom part of the stroke, which is why a good chance when you encounter bad roads like this, you're going to end up bottoming up the suspension, and that's not going to be good, because the suspension works best in the middle part of the stroke. So in that scenario, the way around that problem that you have is that you bump up the preload. And when you bump up the preload, by that you're ensuring that the suspension is then moving from the bottom part of the stroke to a slightly higher part of the stroke, closer to the middle, which means then when you start riding on these kind of roads, the chances of you bottoming out the suspension is going to be that much less, and it's going to add some compliance to the motorcycle and the way it handles bad roads. Now, if we go to the other end of the spectrum and we have a spring which has been designed for a 90 kg guy and you're a 60 kg guy, then you're not even going to be compressing the spring. The suspension is only going to be working in the higher part of the stroke, and again, it's not going to be ideal. You're not going to get the nice plush feeling that you want from your suspension. Like in this case, so when you try and compress the rear shock, that's not going to happen because the spring is just too stiff. But now here's the interesting part. So that's one aspect, right? So obviously adding preload in such a scenario should not work, because the spring is not going to be working in the right part of the stroke. By adding preload to a stiffer spring is going to, firstly, you're going to be sacrificing on the travel, because the spring is only going to be working in the higher part of the stroke. That obviously cannot be the solution, right? But when you're adding preload, you're also increasing the tension in the spring. And when you add tension to a spring, it also makes it a lot more reactive. And we have had some really promising results with it. We started off with barely a click of preload and 2 clicks of preload, and finally I went all in, added all the preload that was available on the rear shock with the intention of making it reactive. The shocks are only adjustable for preload. We cannot really change the damping on the shocks. The damping is essentially, you have compression and rebound. Compression determines how quickly the springs compress. Rebound determines how quickly the springs extend. Now, whatever the settings are, whatever setting which Royal Enfield thought was ideal, that's already been dialed in terms of the valving, and we cannot touch it. But for us to get really good ride quality, what you want is a suspension which is highly reactive to the road surface. So in this case, as we cannot touch the rebound, what we have done is we have added preload, which has added tension and which has made the suspension very reactive. And even though it goes against what most people think, we have actually had really promising results. After testing it on different kinds of terrains or really broken roads at higher speeds, I think we have finally found a solution for the Bear 650, where now by adding this much preload, at least for my 72 kg frame, it's a lot more compliant. Again, this is not a full-fledged solution. I won't even call it a solution per se. It's like more like a band-aid because there is a lot of compromise that we are talking about here. But by doing this, what we have come to discover is the Bear 650 now has suddenly gone from almost the shocks being a deal breaker to a motorcycle which I can definitely live with. And it's really not that bad, especially if you don't have the money to go ahead and get custom springs which will give you the comfort that you seek for your Bear 650. This is a solution which is definitely worth trying, and I've had some really promising results with it. So I encourage you, if you have a Bear 650 or if you're going for a test ride, to add the preload all the way in, especially if you're in the range of 70 to 80 kgs. If you're on the lighter side, then of course don't go all in with the preload, maybe go halfway and see how that works. The intention here is just to make the spring a little more reactive so that it works a little bit better and gives you a little more of composure over broken roads. I would love to hear what you guys think about it. I want you guys to try it, and when you do, please come back to this video and let me know in the comment section how much has it helped your experience on your Bear 650.